Good morning, everyone. I'm going to get us started, only 4 minutes late. My name is Susan Hayes. I'm a cannabis attorney and a lobbyist here in Texas, and I'm going to be moderating today on cannabis regulation and taxation. What can we learn from other jurisdictions? We've got here today Professor Robin Goldstein, who's the director of the Cannabis Economics Group at the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at UC Davis, and he's the co-author of a great book everyone should read called Can Legal Weed Win? The Blunt Realities of Cannabis Economics, which lays out why we don't have cannabis companies making a bunch of money in this country. On the other side of him is Geoffrey Lawrence, the research director at the Reason Foundation, who has worked in multiple jurisdictions, including overseeing financial reporting in Nevada, where he currently lives. And then on the other side of Jeff, Paul Furfaro, who is the president of the Global Medical Cannabis Division at Village Farms, which is a NASDAQ-traded international cannabis company. And Paul previously worked as the regulator for the government of Quebec as they were rolling out adult use cannabis. And I think Paul wins the award for coming the farthest for this contest.
I think so. I think so.
Start with Paul. Can you kind of give us the big picture of how Quebec approached regulating cannabis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that we have to, even before we start talking about cannabis and in terms of legalization and regulation, is today the government that still operates within the province where I'm from is very, very, very anti-cannabis. Okay, it is a product that they don't like. It is a product that I would bet if they had the choice to go back in time and not sell, they would probably opt not to sell it. The only thing the current government, and I think most Quebecers in general dislike more than cannabis, is actually the federal government. So what a fun situation to find yourself in when the federal government tells you, you have no choice, you have to be able to legalize this product. We're giving you a specific date, and we had to find a way to be able to do it. So we said we don't have a choice, and we started looking at how we can actually bring this to market, how we can actually make this work. And the first thing that we started to look at was, this has nothing to do with finance. Right. So my job was not to report into the finance department. We basically said, even if we don't make $1 off it, it's fine. What we decided to do was take a health approach. And that health approach was, we're going to work with the health department. We worked with academics. We worked with practitioners. We worked with health officials from across different areas of health and medicine. And it was not just about health. It was about health and public safety. So we worked a lot with law enforcement. So the idea was, there is a group of consumers that existed and that will continue to exist in an illegal market. And all we wanted to do was take those people and bring them into a safer channel where they'd have access to a quality product, a tested product, and more importantly, a channel where if they wanted it, they were able to get educated in terms of how to use the product, but more importantly, how not to use the product. So while I was there, we hired 1,000 people. Those 1,000 people, in terms of the jobs that we created, all had to go through a government exam that was administered by the government. So to sell cannabis in Quebec, you have to be certified to be able to do it. We opened up 90 dispensaries. And to this day, if you walk into a store and you say, I've never consumed cannabis, but now that it's legal, I'd like to, what do you recommend? The answer is going to be, don't start. So that is a very, very hard message to convey if you're working for the finance department, you're trying to make money. It's a very easy message that all of our employees have tattooed on their heart in terms of being able to go in there from a public health and safety point of view. Okay, so this is the way that the government wanted to be able to tackle it. By the way, I said we didn't have a financial objective. The fact of the matter is, if we did this right, we were going to make money anyways for the province and for the country. So we weren't that concerned. But more importantly, when we started looking at this in terms of how do you migrate somebody from the illicit market into the legal market, we said we need products that are affordable, because price is always going to be important to compete with the illicit market. We wanted products that are available, which means that we had to make sure that in our 90 stores, no matter where you were in the province, if you walked in and you were looking for a product, you'd be able to find it. And we wanted to make sure that we had assortment, right? We needed to be able to give people choice. So not only were we trying to cultivate our relationships with our clients, we're also trying to cultivate relationships with our suppliers, right? And this is something that I'm still doing today at Village Farms, right? So Village Farms, we have rich roots here in Texas, where we're still growing tomatoes in Fort Davis. We're growing tomatoes in Marfa. We're growing tomatoes in the Permian Basin. We have assets in Canada, which led us to become the second biggest company in Canada, second largest cannabis company in Canada. And now we're taking those expertise and we're trying to supply medical cannabis around the world in jurisdictions where it's legal. But at the end of the day, what's really important when you're working with your government boards or when you're working with different partners to distribute this product is you need a lot of product at an affordable price consistently. And that's something that regardless if it's recreational in North America or medical in Australia, all patients are looking for the same thing. Because if at some point in time there's a shock to price, they're going to go back to the illicit market. At some point in time, if there's a shock to supply where it's not available, they're going to find it somewhere else. So that's kind of the way we approach it in Quebec, and the success is there. The most recent numbers that came out of the provinces, we've migrated 63% of the illicit market. Okay, rest of Canada, it's 50%, which is still amazing. But you see, there's something a little bit more magical about what we're trying to do in Quebec, and I think it has a lot to do with education and health. We have numerous studies that are coming out that are saying, and we were just talking about this morning, where impaired driving is on a decrease in terms of there's less people who are consuming cannabis and then getting into a car. That has a lot to do with education. That has a lot to do with the people at the stores who are telling them how to consume it, what the onset's going to be, and how they should not be, operating heavy machinery under the influence. And I think there's other things too, to be able to see where people are contacting their dealers less and less and less. And even though there's no official report to this, I can say as fact in certain cities and towns across Quebec where there's a population of less than 1 million people, there's no more dealers because we've effectively outcompeted them in terms of price, in terms of affordability, and in terms of assortment.
And one of the first things I learned when I met Paul is, Quebec is a really conservative place, which I didn't know. But it's been helpful for me to hear this from him, because it gives me a framework to think about how do we move the ball here in Texas with our very conservative leadership. Okay, Jeff, you've worked in multiple jurisdictions, including Michigan, Nevada. Any differences in approach in those states? And what do you see as sort of best practices and from a big picture perspective?
Sure. So I think in order to be successful in a legal cannabis market, you have to recognize that legal cannabis doesn't exist in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
They have ready-made substitutes, including illicit cannabis or hemp-derived cannabinoids. And so people, consumers, and producers are price sensitive. And so both the regulatory framework that might drive up costs as well as the tax structure are important for keeping the legal market competitive. And certainly some states have done better than others. Where I live in Nevada, one of the big issues is that there is a limited amount of dispensary licenses. There's 120 statewide. And most of them are concentrated in Las Vegas. So for people in remote areas, there's also an access issue. It's also true in California. There's about 10 times as many dispensaries in California, but there are parts of the state where you can be more than 100 miles from the nearest dispensary.
Yeah.
So,
and remind me what the population of Nevada is.
it's about 3 million in Nevada.
All right, compared to the 30 million here in Texas. Okay.
Right. Yeah. But if you compare, let's say, the 120 cannabis retailers to 5,000 liquor stores statewide, clearly there's an imbalance in terms of being able to meet demand. There's also, so states have chosen to tax at multiple levels, wholesale, distributor, retail. Some states allow local governments to assess additional taxes. Nevada does this where they cap the amount that a local government can tax, but it's still an extra 5% on top of a 15% wholesale tax and a 10% retail tax. So these taxes pyramid up and make the final retail price that consumer pays much greater than what they could find out on the street. Same thing in California, where there are jurisdictions in California where not only is there do you pay the state taxes, but you pay local taxes at all three levels based on gross receipts. So you might have a cultivation tax, a distribution tax, manufacturing tax, and a retail tax. And sometimes the taxes are based up for cultivators are based on the square footage of canopy, which really has no direct relationship to the amount of money that the cultivator is bringing in. So all of this kind of pyramids up, and you see that in California, for instance, an estimated 2/3 of demand is still supplied by the illicit market. This is, 25 years, but almost 30 years since the medical market went live in California. So it's the oldest market. It's still the least served by the legal operators. By contrast, Michigan is a relatively new market and has been wildly successful. So what do they do in Michigan? They have one level of taxation at retail. It's 15%. There's regular sales tax is not applied, so it's really just 15% out the door. It's clearly the most competitive market in the Midwest. So you see people, even though Michigan's surrounded by legal states now, and Illinois and Ohio, people from those states drive to Michigan to buy their cannabis because it's the cheapest place to go.
Wow. Traveling for comparative price shopping. Yeah.
That's right.
Robin, you've studied it all and wrote the book. What do you got to add to this?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of those points. I think in California, prices have been plummeting as elsewhere. And so it's been interesting the last couple of years to watch the legal market actually get more competitive on price with the illegal market and take slowly more share. But that's, I think, in spite of a lot of the things we've done to regulate there, not because of. And I think it's important also to note that the problems in California came starting with Prop 64, starting with the rules that were set up from the beginning. It wasn't mostly discretionary things that the agencies did or how they're enforcing it. It was the way the law was written, starting with these multiple layers of taxation. I think Jeff was mentioning that in Michigan, there's 15% just at retail, and that's basically having if you're going to have a tax, put it all at retail. And the reason why is, as you talked about pyramiding, the reason why is you have markups at multiple levels. So if you impose a tax at production, then that gets marked up 50% and then 50% again by the time it gets to retail. The consumer pays the tax either way. But if you tax earlier at an earlier stage, then the government only collects less tax and the consumer ends up paying the multiple. And other things get lost in markup. So that's one way to sort of at least maximize the efficiency or the usefulness of the tax dollars. I think that one thing that gets talked about less, certainly much less in taxes, is all the different ways that regulatory costs get kind of inserted into the system. And people talk also a lot about licensing, not being enough licenses. Of course, that's very important when you have areas with no licenses at all. That's just the equivalent of giving all the turf to the illegal market. So people say, oh, we don't want cannabis in our area. No, you're going to have cannabis in your area. Do you want it to be legal or illegal? So people have known for many decades where to find weed. And so, but I think one of the regulatory costs that's not talked about much that a lot of states are spending a lot on is track and trace. So this metric system, for example, that costs millions of dollars to the state and then millions more dollars for the operators to comply with. And most cannabis businesses I know of in metric states, which is a lot of them, have several full-time employees whose only job it is to enter detailed information about every single transaction and movement of product into this system. And in theory, that's supposed to be a public health or public safety benefit. But in reality, these agencies have a lot to do. They don't have a huge staff of 10 data scientists to analyze 300 million transactions from track and trace system and do anything useful with it. So in general, in many states, I've just seen this data not being used for any sort of public interest, and instead it's just costing money to the state and to the taxpayers and ultimately to consumers, and the business and stopping the businesses from being profitable. In many cases, that makes a difference. I've heard small cannabis businesses say they have 3 or 4 employees and one of them is track and trace. I think that when you're looking at different states and see who's done it kind of better and worse and been more successful, I think the states that have been quite modest about both their tax collection goals and also the size of the agency and the number of rules they have to enforce. When you have the more rules you set up, not only does it impose costs on the businesses and on consumers, but it also it's expensive to run a cannabis agency. And so just the cost of enforcement and running the bureaucracy necessary to have so many layers of systems imposes costs.
Rifle shot regulation helps compete with the illegal market.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at an illegal cannabis business, and you want to compete on price with them, you have to compete on cost with them. And of course, you're not going to compete perfectly on cost. You're going to have to do legal testing that they're not doing. You're paying your taxes that they're not. But on every other level, if you can imitate as well as you can, allow people to run businesses the way that they were running them. For example, in the less regulated medical state in California before 2018, when recreational kicked in, we had a lot of businesses who had figured out efficient ways of operating, dispensaries who had, one security guard, and they had someone who would check your medical recommendation and so forth. But they were very efficiently run, and they didn't have excessive employees in the system that weren't necessary. They were figuring out how to make money and doing it well and supplying good quality product. And they, by telling them how to run their businesses in ways that don't directly translate to public health or safety, we do that at our own peril in terms of competing with the illegal market.
And, now let's talk about licenses and how they are structured. Here in Texas, the TCUP program is one vertically integrated license. The hemp program, every type of license or even registration, like retail is so simple, it's just a registration, is separate. Jeff, how have you seen that play out in different jurisdictions where there are different systems of licensing, whether it's tiered, certain kinds of licenses or have to be independent, like testing labs from producers, that sort of thing? What's the best system?
So the challenge with requiring vertical integration is that it takes a lot of capital, and it's difficult to raise capital in this industry because there are no institutional investors. So you either have to figure out a way to go public, or you have to have a rich uncle that's going to stake a lot of money. You look at, Florida's a market where the medical market requires vertical integration. Arizona originally did as well. And these markets are also largely captured by a small handful of operators because the barriers to entry are high. And so the state's made a limited number of those licenses available. And what that has done has limited the competition within the market. So there's not downward pricing pressure. And as a result, that keeps the legal market less competitive with the illicit market. At Reason Foundation, we always advocate that you should have a very open market with easy entry and exit of firms, which means an unlimited number of licenses for us, and also low licensing fees. So as far as licensing structures, we like Colorado, we like Oklahoma, where you can get a cannabis license for about $2,500. The number of them is not limited. And so, just like gas stations or grocery stores, the total amount of supply is going to be regulated by consumer demand.
And Robin, what do you think about limiting license and how it makes harder? You agree with Jeff, or have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's really attempting. It's like this siren song of limiting licenses. And the weird thing about it politically is that the people who come into the market first and invest a lot and get the first licenses, they then have a bit incentive to want to keep other people out, keeping out the competition. And so you get pressure in the local communities often from existing license holders saying, don't open it to more licenses. It's hard enough for us to survive as it is. And it can be very hard, I think, for local politicians to feel like they're not doing right by, that people can feel they're not doing right by the existing license holders who are struggling to allow more competitors in. But that's not the right approach for the market. If you want to have a market that's competitive with illegal, you have to allow businesses to open and locate as the market dictates. And so one of the big insidious things about the limitation of licenses is that they just end up getting sold. If you create a cartel, an artificially scarce set of licenses, just like taxi medallions in New York City, they get sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and often they're attached to individual locations. And turns out that wasn't the best location for a dispensary, because there's a reason they are going out of business or they want to sell their license. And so someone else has to then come into that same location in many states and try to open a new cannabis business where another one has failed.
Yeah.
Whereas when you have no limitations in licensing, and as well as a cheap and easy and importantly fast process of getting licensed, then you allow the market to work, and some people are not going to survive, and new people are going to come in, and over time it's going to improve and serve demand much better.
It makes me think of buying beer in Lubbock, Texas. For a long time, the only place you could buy beer was Idaloo, which was north of town, or Avenue Q, the Strip, which was southeast of town. And when votes were raised to try to make the other areas of the town wet, guess who funded the campaign against it? The dude who owned all the beer stores on the Strip. Because it was about anti-competition practices. And Paul, in Quebec, the government owns the retail stores. How did y'all think about rolling out how many?
Yeah, it was, so I think the first thing that we had to be able to take a look at was knowing the stance of what the government's point of view of cannabis was. We knew we weren't going to be able to replicate anything that was alcohol and liquor. Alcohol and liquor, there's probably about 450 stores across all of Quebec. That does not include grocery, where you can buy certain types of products, or convenience stores where you can buy other types of products, right? Because now we're in the thousands and thousands, but 450. Part of it was symbolic. We didn't want to have more than 100. Right. And again, part of it was symbolic in terms of just to say that we don't have to be able to open up that many stores. We don't have to be available on every single street corner. And we didn't want to be able to create kind of like green light districts where people were going to be able to get, cannabis and accessories and other types of products. Right. The other thing too that's important is we had to look at the different regions of the province. It's a very, very big province. There are some places that are very, very populated. There are some places that are scarcely populated. So we want to be able to make sure that, we establish a little bit of a criteria where, as long as you can get somewhere within 100 kilometers, you were going to be able to find a store. It was going to be good. That was the intent. That was the ideal, to be able to service the greatest amount of population possible. Then, although there was nothing illegal with us opening up a shop anywhere we wanted to, we want to work with the municipalities. So we went to see city by city to be able to say, do you want us here? And a lot of them said no. And a lot of them continue to say no to this day. And we want to respect their choices of not wanting us kind of in their backyard. The other one too, there were rules that were set in place in terms of not being around schools, not being around children, having to be a little bit careful about how we did that as well. The interesting thing that we did learn though was cannabis was a destination. It didn't matter how far the store was, people were willing to travel to be able to go get it. And again, this was something very, very interesting that we learned over time, right? Which is, if it's available in a legal channel, people will give it a try. If they like it, they'll go back. If it's a little bit further than they like, that's okay. They'll drive to be able to go get it. And over time, those who become of legal age don't know as much about the other system that existed, right? Because they want to go somewhere where it's safe, where it's trusted, where it's clean, where people know me, where I know them, and it's just like a regular retail environment, right? Is 100 enough? No. Do we need more? Absolutely. And I think, again, it's always this question of the government of Quebec was able to migrate 63% of people over. So how do you go get that remaining, 40% or 37% that's still left, right? And again, it's going to come down to affordability, accessibility, and assortment of product.
Yeah.
Paul, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned earlier that you were able to keep price competitive in Quebec. I was wondering what you meant by that, or how you managed to achieve that.
Sure. It was hands down the most important pillar for us to be able to get product out the door. Okay. So the first thing that we did was, if I say state-run monopoly, and you were using the example of the metric employee, right, who has to be there, right? You typically think of these kind of Taj Mahals in terms of the head office that are just these Goliaths in terms of the amount of civil servants that you put in place. We were 3. That's how it started. We were 3 people. Okay.
Wow.
So we were 3 people. We obviously coordinated with the alcohol side of the government to be able to use a lot of shared services. So this was a fee that we paid rather than hiring our own employees. We really, again, this is going to sound so easy, but it was so important. Nobody took a bonus. We said there's a rule in place that this is the only government-run organization that there's not a bonus structure based on sales or based on anything else. So there's no bonus scheme. Everything we did, we opted not to have our own warehouse. So we outsourced the warehouse to be able to stock product, because we said that was going to lower our costs from a rent point of view. That was going to lower our cost from an employee point of view. That was going to lower our cost in terms of a logistics point of view. We don't own the trucks that deliver to the stores. So the government made a decision, which was it's a direct to store distribution model. When we place an order, you as the manufacturer have to be able to deliver to every single store across the province. So, and you have 2 days to be able to do it across 90 stores across the entire province. So we stripped out cost anywhere we could possibly strip out cost to be able to reinvest in price. That reinvestment in price, again, I go back in terms of working with groups like Village Farms, working with different groups across Canada who just had this ability to be able to scale and to be able to produce product. We were very, very transparent with them on, we want favored nation pricing, right? We don't care where it is in Canada. We want to make sure that we have the best price possible. And we were very strict in terms of how to be able to do that. And it was a very honest conversation. It was a very open conversation. There were some very hard negotiations at the bottom, at the beginning. But when you found the right people to be able to do this, we were the lowest price in Canada and we were comparable with the illicit market. Now, comparable with the illicit market does not mean we were 100% competitive with them, but we had a good enough price with a good enough quality and enough locations to be able to drive people in.
And in the end of the day, you added up all these costs, and then you were having to break even as an agency or as a division.
Yeah. So again, very, very interesting point of view. We didn't have to.
Okay.
We did not have to. Okay. But we did. It took us actually 6 months to be able to break even.
Okay.
But it was much more of a volume game than it was as a pricing game and a margin game. And, you know, when you compare to traditional retail, I'll talk about Canada and I'll talk about Quebec. But if I will look at a convenience store that is selling, you know, beer and cigarettes, I mean, they're taking margins of 30, 35% on their products, right? We went in where we were 15 at most. And on some products, we were actually lower than that. So again, it was lean and mean as much as possible. We were a handful of people that kind of started this, and we made some really key decisions about where we can cut costs to be able to reinvest in price, including with some great suppliers that we started off with.
You know, what strikes me hearing you talk about outsourcing and keeping it efficient is it makes me think about a criticism I've had of vertical integration and having worked at cannabis companies where they're trying to do operations, which is a lot harder than it sounds. Okay. It's really, really hard to do everything well. For one company to be good and efficient at cultivating cannabis, at manufacturing cannabis, and the logistics of retail distribution.
Yeah.
And managing stores.
So I think, you know, on one side, when I was with the government, it was very easy to be able to say, well, we're just going to put this on the back of the suppliers, right? I'm on the other side now. Okay. And it is really tough. I mean, Robin, you were saying before, you know, all these regulatory costs. Okay. Every dollar that Village Farms makes on cannabis in Canada, I think it's 73 cents goes back to the government in terms of taxation.
Wow.
In terms of taxation, in terms of regulatory fees. Okay. And we're talking about cannabis. We're not talking about normal payroll taxes. We're not talking about normal corporate income taxes. Okay. We're just talking about every time we sell $1 of cannabis, 73 cents of it goes back to the government in some way, shape, or form. So you're trying to be able to compete with the illegal market, right? What do you want to do? You want to be innovative. You want to be more creative. You want to be able to give more genetics. You have to be able to, you know, when the illegal market makes a buck, okay, they might not be putting the full buck in their pocket, but they're pretty damn close, okay, compared to us. So it's so hard to be able to now find new ways to be able to compete. It's harder to be able to find ways to be able to innovate. It's hard to be able to find ways to be able to train staff because you don't have the resources that you would normally have in any other business to be able to reinvest and do it, right? Makes it really, really complicated. So you have to be good. You have to be good at a lot. You have to be good at almost everything, right? And you don't have the funds to be able to do it. So where do we kind of invest our energy? Where do we kind of invest our time, right? Over 30 years of controlled environment agriculture experience, right? We've been growing in greenhouses around the world, and everything we're doing right in cannabis today has nothing to do with the 6 years of mistakes we've made in legalized cannabis, has to do with the 30 years we've made mistakes in terms of produce and agriculture and growing in greenhouses, right? So that's where we're investing, right? We're investing in the product, we're investing in the people, because that's the best place to be able to continue to fight with the illicit market. And like it or not, you're trying to make your customers, who are the wholesalers, who are the boards, who are buying the product, happy with you. You're trying to service them in the right way. And you're trying to make sure you have the best product possible so that when the consumer's walking in the store and they see one of ours, they go, yes, that's the one I want because it's better than anything else I can get on the street and it's better than anything else I can get in the store.
Yeah. Let's talk about product limitations. Like here in Texas, the medical program led with tinctures followed by edibles. The state hates the idea of flower of any kind, and there's been litigation over that. What have y'all seen in other jurisdictions? Do other states have that attitude where flower goes last, or have there been different sequences of legalization?
In Florida, the legislature was very hostile to the medical marijuana program once it was approved by the voters, and they responded by, passing a statute that made smokable products illegal. That then became the subject of litigation for about 2.5 years, and eventually litigants won, and the state Supreme Court overruled that law, saying it was, in conflict with the initiative. So certainly, this has been a thing that's come up in a handful of particularly southern states. There was some debate about this in the program in Tennessee recently as well. But I would say in the majority of states have not dealt with that.
Yeah.
On the West Coast, especially in the Northeast, even in the Midwest, flower is the dominant product. It accounts for 50 to 60% of all sales, and there hasn't been that kind of effort to keep certain products off the market.
Yeah. Paul, what about Canada?
Yeah, I think in Quebec and in Canada in general, flower first. That's how we started, right? It was flower first. And again, we have to be able to go back where, and actually importantly, in terms of Quebec, flower first is 6 years or close to 6 years post legalization. Vaping products and gummies or edibles are still not permitted in the province of Quebec. Now, that sounds crazy. Okay, let me go back in time in terms of to explain this. Okay, vaping products and edibles, there was a massive concern amongst the health department and amongst the health authorities, where it was very, very difficult to control dosing. And it was easier to overdose on something that was a vaping product because you don't know when to stop, or a gummy or an edible because you eat too much. And there were already a lot of examples within the emergency rooms that people were showing up. Now, when somebody shows up because they consume too much alcohol, there's almost an operation that has to take place. When somebody shows up because they consume too much THC, they kind of just gotta wait it out and drink some water and kind of like calm down and not be so paranoid. Okay, but so there's different things, but there was definitely this evidence in the emergency rooms. Okay, there was also a concern with vaping products and edibles that it was more appealing to youth. And again, when you're looking at it from a health and safety point of view, this appeal to youth, there was a little bit of a concern there. So we went big on flower first. Why? Because that's what people are using. We know that the illegal market predominantly over the past 100 years are people are buying flower. That's what they're using. And if you want to be able to compete with that, you have to be able to have product to be able to compete with that. What's even more interesting in terms of my job today, looking at medical cannabis, right? In all jurisdictions around the world that were selling medical cannabis, obviously, from a doctor's perspective, they would like to be able to prescribe more oils and more tinctures because there's a harm reduction aspect to that in terms of not getting flower that you may end up smoking, but none of them have an issue prescribing it. As long as they're educated, as long as they understand, they don't have an issue prescribing it, because that's also what the patients are looking for globally, right? They know how to use the product because they've been using it before. A lot of people started self-medicating themselves with it, and then they eventually ended up speaking to a doctor, to a practitioner, to a pharmacist to better use the product. They know the effect it's going to have on their body. They know how long that effect is going to be, and they're just looking for a better quality product. But flower first is so important in terms of fighting the illegal market, whether it's recreational or medical.
Yeah. I would add to that. I've seen data from all over the country, every state we look at. It's true. Flower is, I wouldn't say dominant necessarily, less so than it used to be, but it's the majority of the market in every state. And it's the majority of market by value, let's say by retail value, but that actually understates how much flower really dominates the market, because there's this kind of vast territory of low-priced flower, the low-end flower, the low-end market, where and a huge amount of the total cannabis is being consumed by very price-sensitive consumers who consume a lot. And those overwhelmingly tend to be flower consumers and people who buy, an ounce or more, a month, or let's say. And
yeah, I just drove through New Mexico and Colorado and Montana, and I was stunned to see $70 an ounce advertised everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and you're seeing those prices plummet, and that's the best thing that could happen for competitiveness of the legal market. Because if you really want to take this whole thing and turn it legal, you have to reach these low-end consumers who are going to buy the cheapest stuff they find anywhere that's satisfactory quality. And the truth is, the quality on the illegal market is satisfactory in most places. It's good. In New York, the quality in the illegal market's better than the quality in the legal market because it's coming from California. Good weed in New York. So, I mean, but anyone who's kind of denying this, so when you look at prices and prices being competitive, you have to look, what's the cheapest eighth on the menu? What's the cheapest ounce on the menu? Is that competitive? That's really tough because the really big suppliers who have national networks are doing their best to get the cheapest weed possible in the hands of the illegal distribution system. And so when we look at the data, when we analyze the data in terms of different segments, we don't just look at flour, oil, edibles and so forth. We look at low-end flour and separate that out. And what's the, for example, we survey every store on Weed Maps and we say, what's the cheapest eighth and what's the cheapest ounce on their whole menu? And then we take averages and medians of the cheapest, and we look at the competitiveness of the cheapest as another, I think, more important marker of how much you're able to take share for the legal market.
Okay.
I think again, I just have to add to that because it is so important in terms of also the way that we're looking at the competitive environment, right? When I use the word affordability, what's really important is there are different customers or there are different consumers who some want something a little bit more expensive, some want the what's your strongest, what's your cheapest, right? We hear that all the time, right? And this notion of THC and price is so intertwined because somebody will walk into a store and say, what's your strongest? And you'll say, oh, we have this product at X% THC. And then they'll say, okay, great, what price? And you explain the price and they're like, great, what's your strongest at $20, right? So again, then price becomes very, very key, right? So this notion of affordability is you have to be able to offer something to all clients, regardless of what price they feel comfortable paying, right? But what's at the floor, what's the cheapest is so important because, and you got the competitive environment is if you're only making a couple of cents, for every dollar that you make, the example I used before that 73 cents is going to the federal or is going to the governments and we're making 27, right? There's a lot of companies who are trying to survive because they don't have the infrastructure to be able to compete at those prices. And if you're trying to survive, at the last minute, when everything's going bad and you're going bankrupt, you are going to liquidate everything you have. And we see that in Canada. There's always something that is just lowering the floor in terms of the prices because somebody's trying to liquidate their inventory. They're trying to get it out of the market. So you're trying to be able to compete with the illicit market and the illegal market in terms of pricing. You're trying to be able to compete with people who are kind of like, throwing everything they can at the market, even though, it might mean the end of their business, but they're trying to survive. It makes it incredible to be able to really figure out what that price point is.
All right, I'm going to throw a speed round at all of y'all. What's the answer, the best way to tax, including the rate, and the best use of the revenue? Want to go, Jeff?
Sure. So we like a single level of taxation at retail, like Robin said, and I think less than 15% seems to be an amount that doesn't create a huge bias. There aren't many states below that level. Massachusetts is one, but they have limited retail. Michigan. So those seem to be the states that mostly are working on the tax front. How to use the money? First, cover the cost of regulation. We're generally less interested with where the money goes. But clearly there's also a public safety aspect that tends to get overlooked a lot because law enforcement doesn't, in a lot of states, they don't have the expertise to evaluate drugged driving, for instance. So you have to provide drug recognition expert training, and you need funding for that. In some states, there's been a reluctance to give any money to law enforcement as part of a legalization program. But if you want to have safe roads, that's part of where it needs to go.
Okay. Paul?
I think not enough goes to enforcement. not enough goes to law enforcement. I think that's one of the key things, and I don't have a good example out of Canada, including Quebec, that it does. Okay, but law enforcement is so important because if you can get this right in tandem, in terms of money being generated and then goes to law enforcement, and the money being generated is to migrate people from the illegal market into the legal market, and there's funds that are used to be able to support that, that would be a win-win. That would really, really be a win-win. I will say that, I spoke about, our produce background. I spoke about Canada. I spoke about global medical cannabis. We also have one of the licenses in the Netherlands, right, to be able to open up as part of their coffee shop experiment that they're doing over there. They've gone out with zero taxation. Okay.
Wow.
We like that policy, especially at the beginning. Because as you're trying to be able to build facilities, as you're trying to be able to educate people, as you're trying to be able to roll out zero tax at the beginning, I mean, how can you say no to that from a manufacturer and a production side? Okay. But this is something that we rarely see in other jurisdictions. But again, the Dutch government has said we have a long history and legacy with the illegal market, and we have to be able to bring people over, and we know price is going to be important. So that's something that they've given to everybody in the pilot project to be able to have zero taxation. In Quebec, because of the way we do it a little bit different because of the health mandate, the numbers that came out for 2023 was $300 million were generated in terms of tax revenue. Now, the $300 million that was generated in terms of tax revenue, about 250 million stayed within the province. So about 50 million went to the federal government, 250 stayed within the province. Of the 250 that stayed within the province, 50 million went into the normal, let's call them government coffers to be able to do whatever they want with.
General revenue.
General revenue, thank you. 200 million stayed within a specific fund that was created when legalization happened in the province. And this fund is half dedicated to prevention and half dedicated to research. So on the prevention side, there's $100 million that was generated last year so that you can see campaigns around, don't consume cannabis and drive, don't leave cannabis out in the open where your pets and your animals can eat them. So a lot of that, and that's a great way to be able to fund public awareness campaigns, health and safety campaigns. So that's fantastic. And then the other side is in a fund that if you're a researcher, if you're an academic, if you're a practitioner, you can actually write a research proposal, and you can go solicit funds from the government to be able to advance research on cannabis and knowing what you want to know.
I think the best way to increase and improve public health and safety is to get as much legal cannabis into people's hands instead of illegal cannabis. For kids to be in harm's way from receiving illegal product instead of legal product, because it's too expensive and kids are going to get their hands on it one way or the other. The more of the supply that's out there that's coming from the illegal market, the more people are at risk especially of consuming something that is either unlabeled or labeled incorrectly. The most important thing about legal cannabis of all is the fact that it's labeled, and there should be very harsh penalties for mislabeling or for intentionally selling something false. And the best way to achieve this is to take every single dollar that you would be collecting with some government investment in a safety awareness campaign and put that into helping legal cannabis be competitive on price with illegal. So if I were a state, I would not collect tax. I would not impose any special cannabis tax. I wouldn't set up a special fund that was then going to invest more in awareness campaigns or anything else. I would, if necessary, use other government funds for those initiatives, but I think that keeping taxes at the lowest level possible. There's no special tax on tomatoes or strawberries. People pay sales tax that covers the operations of the agriculture departments and so forth, and they could do the same thing with. You don't have to balance the budget with cannabis. You can, if your intention is to move this to the legal market, you can take a loss on that portion of your operations.
Yeah.
Agreed wholeheartedly. And again, zero tax in Netherlands is the right way to be able to do it to get things rolling properly.
Right. Another quick question, and we'll see if we can squeeze in some questions from the audience. And many of you already touched on this. Is enforcement. Like here in Texas, the city of Allen, which is north of Dallas, just raided 8 hemp shops after mystery shopping and testing products they bought. New York is trying to shut down their innumerable unlicensed dispensary, which seems like to me an ineffective way to do much of enforcement when you've got a raging black or gray markets. what are y'all, anything y'all are seeing in other jurisdictions that is effective for enforcement?
My side is no.
No.
My side is no. It's really sad to say. It's really, really sad to say. There's not enough money. There's not enough resources. There's not enough attention that's being pulled to it, right?
Yeah.
And depending on who you're speaking to, and depending on who you're talking to, the answer is, well, you guys open up shops, so that should be good enough, right?
Yeah.
It's not. It's really, really not.
You got to compete.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're on the manufacturing side. It doesn't matter if you're on the government side. It doesn't matter if you're just a retailer. It doesn't matter if you're vertically integrated, right? You're not competing by the same rules. You're not competing by the same rules. And you cannot outcompete people who don't have to be able to pay taxes. You can't outcompete people who are not paying the same regulatory fees. I mean, we've said it 100 times, but it doesn't matter where I am in the world, what market I'm looking at, right? It's not enough. It's not enough.
Jeff?
If you would have told me 10 years ago that states like California and New York would have, where people would invest into brick and mortar illegal storefronts and do it like thousands of times over, I would have been shocked. It's pretty audacious. And what I take from that is because people are making an investment and putting their name out on front of the door, they're exposed to a lot of risk. And I think the majority of unlicensed operators would prefer to be licensed. The problem is it's very difficult to get a license in a place like California. Even though they have unlimited number, you have to get through a CEQA.
Local jurisdictions can ban them. And
Right. There are a lot of barriers to doing it. In New York, there's only, they made a certain number of licenses available for retailers, 200. And you had to, people who were eligible to apply was a very kind of narrow subsegment of the population. And so other people who have been selling weed maybe on the legacy market for decades wanted to get in, but there's not a pathway to transition legacy suppliers to the legal market. And so what you see is this proliferation of still unlicensed sellers. And the way you go about that is open up the licensing.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think in New York, you're seeing so many thousands out there that there's this kind of myth that if you start shutting them down, that's going to somehow help things for the legal guys. It's not. It's not going to change the market price of illegal weed by going around and making an example of a few, shutting down a few stores. And it wasn't the will of the voters or the people in legalizing cannabis to increase the number of cannabis arrests and imprisonments that happen as a result of the law. Make it competitive and make it easy to get in. Let smoke shops. Many of the illegal sellers are not stores that's specially open to sell cannabis. Actually, single-purpose retail, we were talking about this yesterday, single-purpose retail is a very bizarre retail model. The fact that in every state that's set up a legal weed system, it's a store that only sells cannabis and it can't be sold where tobacco or alcohol is sold. That's a huge barrier in a place like New York where you have smoke shops and convenience stores on every block that are perfectly well equipped to be selling cannabis. They're already
very expensive real estate on top of it.
They have expensive real estate. They're located in the right places. They're open the right hours. They're used to serving people who they have to ID for on age for tobacco or for alcohol. These people are perfectly equipped to be the cannabis retailers, and they're selling illegal weed because there's no path to legal sales for them. There's nothing they could do to get a legal dispensary license, even if you made an unlimited number of licenses and made it really easy to get. There's no way they could do that without giving up their entire convenience store business where they're making all this money on tobacco and alcohol, and that's extremely risky, and they'd go out of business if they did that. So you'd have thousands of legal retailers everywhere in a much more competitive market if you just lifted this restriction on tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis and being retailed by the same.
So instead of thinking about liquor stores, cannabis stores, we might start thinking about regulated sales stores.
Yeah, and that's the future. I mean, 10 years, 20 years in the future, I can't imagine a world where you're not buying weed at every place now that you might, like a Walmart or a place that you'd see, I know it's different state by state, but a place that's selling other stuff.
Yeah, perhaps in Texas, we'll mix it with our gun stores.
Or the drive-up margaritas. You could
drive-up margaritas. All right, quick question. from the audience. Piper over there in the corner. Oh, Heather's got a microphone.
So on the question of how taxes should be spent, I get, nobody wants taxes, but are there any states that are, I mean, Robin, you kind of touched on this, but any states that are spending any money on promoting illegal markets as an alternative to the black markets? And I mean, it seems like that would be an effective way to promote legal markets.
I've seen some initiative. I've seen more negative advertising than positive advertising. Let's say that, scaring people about the risks of unlicensed cannabis, especially when it comes to vapes. I've seen a lot of education campaigns saying legal vapes are safer than illegal vapes. I think it's true. It's an area where it's even more important to get the legal product because it's not just a plant. You have these residual solvents that can really be poisonous. Although it's still important to keep in mind that there have been approximately 0 deaths from cannabis, from overdoses, or from contaminated product in history. So,
well, the Uvalde outbreak before the pandemic killed some people.
But
yeah,
it's compared to the
from additives from black market.
And that's the one most
that's the most
risky area. But I don't know. Have you guys seen any positive campaigns for legal? I mean, it's funny.
So they do this thing in New York where they give the licensed retailers like a special decal they can put in their store window. And when you walk by one, what it signals right away is that, oh, this store is more expensive.
Don't shop here.
Right.
And you can't get California weed there. You can only get New York State weed.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean,
the only one that I can think of that was a little bit in the positive light from memory was the Ontario cannabis store. So the Ontario government went out with some pretty funny ads actually, which showed people buying black market illegal meat. And they were basically saying, you wouldn't buy meat this way, you shouldn't be buying cannabis this way, right? But again, it was like that's, and again, it's still a far cry from the question you're asking, right? But it's the closest I can actually think of.
But I think there are some strategies that could work. And one is denominations of origin where people know where it's coming from. One of the weird phenomena, I think, in the legal cannabis market is that you actually generally have indoor weed costing more than outdoor. And that's kind of partly for historical reasons, but partly because of this THC, this very strong correlation between THC and price, and people are getting stronger stuff indoors. But I think that when you look at, for example, the wine market, you see that what consumers are actually willing to pay a lot more for on the high end is something where they know the story behind it and exactly where it comes from and who made it.
Yeah,
and
visited the vineyard.
Yeah, exactly. And with cannabis branding, I feel like that hasn't really worked its way in sufficiently. Not many states have appellation of origin kind of systems where it's certified where it's coming from.
Did California ever pass one? I knew they were working on it.
They're still working on it. They've got this, several years long study on it. But there's certain brands like Humboldt County that have, or Mendocino that have this
worldwide
potential
fame.
to be, right, they could be big export products in an international market. And that's going to help, that high end is a small segment of the consumers, but it's a lot of money and it can help the industry and certainly tax collections if they're able to properly market this high-end premium stuff. I don't know if you guys have seen any of that working elsewhere, but not so much of it.
I mean, because of our affiliation when I was with the government, because of the affiliation with the alcohol side, we shared a lot of stories about 100 years of alcohol prohibition, what that actually means. And not that there's anybody around in the business that remembers these days, but for a very, 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 very long time, wine was red or white, bottle or box, right? It was kind of like that's pretty much what you were buying it in. We are far, far away from being able to do that in cannabis, right? And I think that we always at Village Farms we always talk about the rear view mirror that other industries have. 100 years of alcohol, 100 years of tobacco, 100 years of all these other things. We don't have that rear view mirror, right? And when we start looking at what the runway in front of you is, you're a little bit concerned that it's going to go off a cliff because everybody's going to run out of money because it's so expensive to be able to compete legally and properly under the regulatory environment, right? Branding and storytelling is so important. but you don't have the same marketing, freedoms. You don't have the same, abilities to be able to communicate, right? So it's going to get there. It's definitely going to get there. We are definitely working on that as well, in terms of, our international sales, but it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time.
Okay. More questions? Peter? Oh, let's let the guy in the back.
You guys are starting to hit on this, but branding and marketing is the only way we can compete with the illicit market, right? We will never be able to compete on price. If they don't pay taxes, they don't get it third-party tested, we simply will not beat them on price. But where we can is the user experience, right? That branding, that marketing, that storytelling, and I think also social consumption lounges, right? And that's part of my question on regulation is, what is the strategy for allowing social consumption lounges so we can treat cannabis more like we do bars, right? Because right now, all the dispensaries we have are liquor stores, right? There are places you go, you get your product, you take it home, and that's it, right? But we as a society have decided, I'm willing to pay more for a beer, right? If I'm having it at a bar with my friends, right? I know I can go to the liquor store and get a 6-pack for half the price, but I'm choosing to pay more for the experience. And I do think we can beat the illicit market on that experience if we give consumers a place to consume these goods in public without a stigma, and have more of a user experience, a night out experience with it that is highly branded or fits with the story of what they want to support in the industry.
Nevada, take it.
Yeah.
So Nevada recently launched social consumption lounges. There are 20 permitted statewide. Social consumption lounges have existed for quite a while in Oakland, West Hollywood, certain jurisdictions of California, but not statewide. There's definitely an argument that it is a more inviting atmosphere for people. So consumption lounges have been limited, particularly in California, where they were not allowed to serve food for a while for some reason. They couldn't have live entertainment. That kind of takes the allure out of it. So they should operate like bars. And you're starting to see some bars across the country are serving cannabis beverages now. That might be hemp derived, but it's that's really taken off in Minnesota. I understand that it's available here in Texas, actually. And that's a cannabis beverage is a lower barrier to entry for a lot of consumers who aren't used to smoking marijuana.
Yeah. A social consumption lounge is competing with social consumption lounges that already exist everywhere, which is people's living rooms. And so I think the challenge for the consumption lounges is you have to provide an experience that's way cooler and different from sitting in your living room smoking some weed. And when they say, for example, you can't sell alcohol and cannabis in the same consumption lounge, then you have a group of friends who want to go out together. Not everyone wants to smoke weed. Some people want to drink beer, and then you're leaving out half that group. And so where are they going to go? They'll either go to a bar where some of them can go outside and smoke, or they'll go to someone's house to do that. So if you enable people to do that by not limiting having these single-purpose establishments, that's I think a big key to it. But I think beverages is also a big key to it, and that's really how it's happening. I mean, because actually alcohol consumption is slowly coming down, and THC beverages seem to be increasing. So insofar as they get, if they're illegalized in the next farm bill, and by some clarification, and that industry is kind of chilled, that would be a step backward, I think, for social consumption that you're seeing arise naturally right now in bars. It started in Minnesota, I guess. And it's here, and it's. I know that Eighth Wonder and others are doing quite well with it, and I think that's a big part of the future for it.
All right. Peter?
Morning. There it goes. Yep. No, you can hear me. Hi. So my name is Peter Stout. I run the crime laboratory for the city of Houston. So yeah, I'm the narc in the room over here. So I talk with, and I'm a toxicologist by training. So, I do drugs for a living, only just kind of a different way. But you started to mention about impaired driving and law enforcement sides of things. So I'm really interested for you to talk more on that. What are you seeing in terms, I know what I see from my kind of professional end of it, but but from you all's perspective, what you're seeing of models that are working around that, models that aren't working. You talked about DRE officers, support for how we deal with the impaired driving side of things. I'm really interested in what's your experience, what you're seeing, what works and what doesn't work there.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'll jump in to start. So prior to legalization, we were working with a lot of law enforcement, and the conversations were very difficult because everybody had a new technology, everybody had a new device that was going to be able to measure it on the spot and to be able. So again, none of those 6 years after legalization, none of those are any closer to fruition than they were back then. Then there were a lot of weird kind of ethical, medical debates on, are you able to do a blood test, as soon as you pull somebody over? Are you able to take a, follicle of their hair to be able to get it tested? And then do you hold them in a cell for 72 hours as you're waiting for the results, right? So all of it was incredibly wasteful in terms of time because we never came up with a good solution. So on the law enforcement side, it is the old ways are sometimes the best ways, right? Which is the person slurring their speech, is the person having a difficult time stringing a sentence together? Are their eyes red? Or do they smell? Again, we were joking about this before. Do you smell because you just came back from a concert, or do you smell because you consumed? Then there's a lot of personal judgment that actually gets applied on that situation. And the personal judgment has to be overridden sometimes with education and not with personal bias. So a lot of the work when we talk about education, there was a lot of education that was done with law enforcement as well, in terms of, yes, drugs are bad. And yes, you grew up knowing that, but now some drugs are legal. And if they're legal, there are certain ways you can, and there's certain ways you can't consume them. What we do know from a couple of studies that were out there was from the beginning of legalization. I think the number off the top of my head was something like 27%. Again, I hope I'm not misquoting the study that I read, but it was about 27% of people that were interviewed did say, yeah, I'll smoke a joint and I'll get in a car and drive. That's dropped down to something like 15% right now. Okay. That has a lot to do with education, but it has a lot to do with education at the store level. When people are coming in and you start explaining to them how to be able to properly use the product. And again, it can be annoying and it can be laborious and you could hear it for the 100th time, but hopefully it actually sinks in and people are using that to their advantage and not, jumping behind the wheel of a car after they're consuming an edible or vaping a product or smoking it.
To my knowledge, there's no test that can verify whether you've used it in the last however many hours, right? I mean, is there something new out there? I'm curious, because if there's not, then there's no fair way to do it. I mean, you can't have.
It's a mixed bag per se laws compared to panel. And yes, struggle from toxicology standpoint of what to test, what to report, how do we testify about it, what is apparent.
I think all you can detect is whether someone smoked in the last maybe week or month, right?
But it's tighter than that. It's still, it's
Murky.
difficult to testify in court, criminal charge as to was the person impaired at the time of stop the accident.
Yeah.
Stupid.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't see any way around that until there's new technology. I mean, you just have to go on whether they were driving unsafely.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge, how do you define inebriation? It would be cleaner if you could come up with a per se objective standard. But, if someone smokes regularly, and they're going to have it's going to be stored in their system. And it might be, someone who hasn't smoked in 2 days, but normally smokes several times a day is going to have, tests comparably to someone who doesn't smoke regularly, but smoked 2 hours ago. Right. So, the only thing out there that seems to be working, and nobody wants a subjective standard, is to train officers as drug recognition experts.
So, the public education, and Christine Adams with the Transportation Institute's in the audience. She and I have talked about this issue of consuming cannabis and consuming alcohol and how much more impaired you are, even if you don't think you are. Should consumption lounges allow both alcohol and THC beverage sales in the same place? And an idea I kicked up that I'm not sure Christine bought was, if I want to go hang out with my friend who likes martinis, consumers have to pick a lane when you go to the bar and order? If you get pick the THC lane, you get a wristband. That means that's all you can have all night, and vice versa with the alcohol. Yeah. And the cool thing about Christine, she's a transportation safety nerd, but she also used to be a bartender. One more.
make a comment about this is that in Germany, there were some attempts to look at the amount of THCA in the saliva, which indicates the amount of smoked cannabis, but there's other ways of consuming cannabis, and that
Absolutely.
And I have a question that is different from this question that is related to some taxation. And I'm sure maybe you have seen the reports by Whitney Economics about the amount of hemp-derived products that were sold in Florida and Texas. These reports are based on the tax reports at the state level. Close to $2 billion in sales in hemp-derived products per year in Texas. And 9% sales tax in the stores. The math is about $150 to $200 million in tax dollars in the state. Is that right? In other jurisdictions, I believe those high taxes are being used to cannabis control commissions, enforcement, and regulations. I think Texas has very quickly learned in 1 year that in an open, unregulated cannabis market, there's a lot of, at 9%, there's a lot of dollars. I'd be very interested if there's any traces of where this money is going to. What happens if there's over-regulation of hemp-derived products and there's a lack of that $200 million? It goes back into the black market, probably. I'd love to hear your comments.
Are you asking about where that sales tax money goes now?
Or isn't that a solution right there to actually use $200 million to open the market, set the playing level field for everybody at 15% taxation, medical, recreational?
The budget nerd answer to that question from a Texas policy point of view is that sales tax money has hit the general revenue pot. So it's divvied up in our regular budget. I think to carve money off specifically to cannabis regulation, education, law enforcement costs like crime labs, you would have to have a new taxation level, like a separate cannabis product tax. And then that is segregated off as in effect a user fee to fund it. Just the way the Texas budget works and legislative process works. Any other thoughts from you guys?
So Reason Foundation's proposal is that states should just start implementing a universal cannabis retail license, which covers both state-regulated cannabis as well as hemp-derived cannabinoids, and also issue a cannabis retail sales tax certificate. So there's a uniform tax rate between the two products at lower than what cannabis is. So like kind of like leveling the playing field between those two product groups, because let's face it, hemp-derived cannabinoids only exist because state-regulated cannabis is not price competitive.
Yeah. And Robin, what's your number for a separate cannabis sales tax?
0.
What's your second number? Second pick.
6%. Tennessee. Tennessee has chosen to regulate cannabinoid, hemp-derived cannabinoid products, and I think in a way that would be very reasonable for a recreational adult use cannabis system. They have basic safety precautions like 21 and over age. They have you can't be near schools. Very strict labeling rules and testing rules. 6% cannabis tax. That's on top of their 7% ordinary sales tax, and then local jurisdictions have an option of adding a bit more, which can get tricky. But to me, that's a reasonable system. What's funny about it is that they set it up without the intent of legalizing recreational cannabis. Whether they actually did or not is a subject of great debate. But you're seeing a lot of the ways that hemp, I think, is being regulated as actually good models for all cannabis, as Jeff says. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, anything? We're way over time and people only have 2 minutes for a potty break. So,
All right.
yeah. Thank y'all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.